The Green Void, the Mato Grosso expedition. In the summer of 2017, a commercial logging crew was cutting a new access road deep in the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso, about 300 miles away from any paved highway. It is a part of the Amazon basin, where the canopy is so thick that the ground is just in perpetual twilight, and you can't see more than 10 feet in front of your face. While clearing a patch of heavy vines, one of the operators spotted something unnatural in the mud. It was a bright orange, heavy-duty Pelican case. Inside, wrapped in a plastic Ziploc bag, was a high-capacity SD card. When Brazilian authorities finally managed to recover the corrupted video files from that card, what they saw didn't make any sense. The footage showed 3 young American men, and honestly, they didn't look like seasoned explorers. They were covered in mud, completely emaciated, and they looked absolutely terrified. But the thing that really disturbed the investigators wasn't the sheer panic in the men's voices. It was what was visible in the background of the video. Just behind the tree line, barely visible through the torrential rain, were massive, perfectly straight, carved stone columns. And there are no ancient stone columns supposed to be anywhere in that part of the Amazon. But to understand how those 3 guys ended up screaming into a camera in the middle of an uncharted jungle, we have to go back to a very normal, very messy apartment in a sprawling suburb of Columbus, Ohio, about 8 months earlier. Marcus Thorne was 28 years old, and he was not an adventurer. He was a mid-level data analyst for a regional auto insurance firm. His daily life consisted of endless spreadsheets, sitting in traffic on Interstate 71, and drinking stale, lukewarm coffee from the office break room. But Marcus had a deep, almost unhealthy obsession with satellite archaeology. He would spend hours every single night glued to his dual monitors, scanning high-resolution topographical maps of the Amazon basin. He was looking for the lost city of Kuhikugu, or maybe even the legendary city of Z that Percy Fawcett disappeared trying to find back in the 1920s. And then, one night in November, at around 3 a.m., surrounded by crumpled junk mail and empty energy drink cans, Marcus found something. It was a faint, perfectly geometric shadow on the satellite feed. A massive square, measuring almost exactly 500 feet by 500 feet, hidden under the canopy, about 40 miles east of a remote tributary of the Xingu River. And Marcus was convinced he had just discovered the archaeological find of the century. So he pitched the idea to his younger brother David and their childhood friend Eric. They were just regular guys. They spent their weekends watching football and going to local breweries. But the idea of being the ones to discover a lost civilization was intoxicating. So they spent thousands of dollars at REI. They bought top-of-the-line moisture-wicking shirts, expensive hiking boots, GPS communicators, and machetes. They really thought it was just going to be an extreme camping trip, a crazy 2-week vacation that would give them the ultimate story to tell back home. They had absolutely no idea what they were walking into. And the first few days of the expedition actually went exactly according to plan. They flew into Cuiabá, took a rattling bus to the edge of the river, and hired a local guide named Hector who had a motorized aluminum boat. They traveled upriver for 3 days, pushing deeper and deeper into the green maze. The physical discomfort was immediate and intense. It was 100 degrees outside with 95% humidity, and the air was so thick it felt like breathing through a wet towel. The mosquitoes were relentless, biting right through their expensive gear. But they were excited. The camera footage from those first few days shows them laughing, drinking warm beers, and pointing out exotic birds. But then, on the morning of the 4th day, the reality of their situation began to fracture. They had set up camp on a muddy riverbank the night before, planning to start the 40-mile overland trek at dawn. When Marcus unzipped his tent at 6 a.m., the first thing he noticed was that Hector's hammock was empty. At first, it made sense. Hector was probably just down by the river checking the boat. But when Marcus walked down to the water, the boat was still securely tied to a thick mangrove root. Hector's heavy rubber boots were still sitting right outside his tent. His machete was still leaning against a log, but Hector was just gone. He had vanished into the jungle barefoot. And as Marcus stood there, trying to process why an experienced guide would wander into the Amazon without his boots or his blade, Eric walked up behind him, holding their expensive satellite GPS device. The screen wasn't dead, it had full battery, but the map was completely gone, replaced by a single flashing error code that just read, "No signal." And that's when David stepped out of his tent and pointed out the most disturbing detail of all. The Amazon jungle is famously loud, a constant, deafening roar of cicadas, howling monkeys, and birds. But as the three men stood there on the muddy bank, looking at the empty boots, they realized the jungle was completely, absolutely dead silent. You don't really understand how terrifying true silence is until you experience it in a place that is supposed to be deafening. The Amazon is a living, breathing machine. It is supposed to scream. But standing there on that muddy bank, Marcus, Eric, and David heard absolutely nothing. No water lapping against the aluminum hull, no wind in the canopy, nothing. And honestly, human psychology is a funny thing because when faced with the impossible, your brain immediately scrambles to build a logical bridge. David, who grew up in Tornado Alley in Oklahoma, was the first to break the silence. He wiped the sweat off his forehead and said, "It's a barometric pressure drop." And at that point, it made perfect sense. In the Midwest, right before a massive supercell hits, the birds stop singing, the insects go quiet, the air gets incredibly heavy. A massive tropical storm was rolling in, which brings us to Hector. If a massive storm was coming, Hector, an indigenous guide who had spent his entire life on this river, would know it. He wouldn't need his boots or his machete if he was just running 50 feet up the bank to grab some broadleaf palm fronds to cover the boat's outboard motor. He probably woke up, felt the pressure drop, and rushed to secure their perimeter. The GPS glitch? Heavy cloud cover and atmospheric interference. It was a perfectly neat, perfectly logical explanation. They convinced themselves that everything was fine. They just needed to batten down the hatches and wait for the rain. So they waited. They sat in their expensive REI camping chairs, drinking lukewarm water from their Nalgene's, staring up at the canopy. 1 hour passed. Then 2. By 11 a.m., the temperature had climbed to 104 degrees. The humidity was suffocating, but the sky, visible through the trees, remained a brutal, unbroken, blinding blue. There was no storm, there was no wind, and the silence never broke. That was when the false reality they had built for themselves completely collapsed. Marcus couldn't take the waiting anymore. He grabbed his machete and walked up the muddy embankment into the tree line, calling out Hector's name. Eric and David followed close behind. About 30 feet into the dense foliage, they found Hector's footprints in the soft, dark mud. But the moment they looked at the tracks, the bottom dropped out of their stomachs. The footprints didn't make sense. They were deep, indicating a lot of weight or force, but they were spaced almost 12 feet apart. No human being on Earth has a 12-foot running stride, especially not barefoot in knee-deep Amazonian muck. And there were no drag marks, no signs of slipping. It looked as if Hector had been bounding through the jungle like a gazelle, or, as David later whispered to the investigators, as if he was being carried away by something massive that only touched the ground every 12 feet. But it got worse. A few yards further, they found Hector's handheld VHF radio. It was lying in the center of a massive, crushed fern. Eric picked it up, and his hands started shaking. The radio wasn't just broken. The thick, military-grade plastic casing was warped and melted, as if it had been exposed to a blast of localized, extreme heat. But the leaves underneath it were perfectly green and unburned. The logic was completely gone. They were 200 miles from civilization, their guide had vanished in a physically impossible way, their electronics were dead, and the jungle was still holding its breath, watching them. Marcus was the first to break the paralysis. He didn't say a word. He just turned around, dropping his expensive machete into the mud, and sprinted back toward the riverbank. And honestly, you can't blame him. When your brain encounters something so fundamentally wrong, so entirely outside the boundaries of physics and reality, survival instinct takes over. It is a very ugly, very selfish thing. Eric and David were right behind him. They didn't look for Hector anymore, they just ran. When they reached the boat, the panic really set in. Eric grabbed the pull cord for the outboard motor and yanked it. The cord didn't resist, it just crumbled in his hand. The internal plastic components of the motor had melted together into a useless, fused lump of slag, just like the radio. So, they untied the mooring line and they paddled. They drifted downriver for 4 days. 4 days of blistering 100-degree heat, drinking untreated river water that gave them violent dysentery, jumping at every single splash, and never, ever speaking. They were completely silent. When a Brazilian logging barge finally spotted them drifting about 40 miles upstream from Manaus, they were severely dehydrated and covered in sandfly bites. And this is where the procedural messiness of real life always ruins the adventure. There was no grand rescue. They were just hauled into a sterile, concrete interrogation room at the federal police headquarters. You know the kind of room: flickering fluorescent lights, the smell of stale cigarette smoke, drinking terrible instant coffee out of little plastic cups. The investigators thought they had murdered Hector. And at that point, it made sense. 3 rich Americans go into the jungle, only 3 come out. It's a tale as old as time down there. The lead detective practically laughed in their faces when David tried to explain the 12-foot footprints and the melted radio. They were facing life in a Brazilian prison. But then, the police confiscated their gear, including David's camera. David was old school. He shot on a mechanical Leica 35mm because, as he always said, batteries die in the humidity. The police developed the film hoping to find evidence of a struggle. Instead, they found something else. About 12 hours into the interrogation, the detective walked back into the room. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked pale, sick almost. He didn't say a word. He just slid an 8x10 glossy photograph across the scratched metal table. David looked at it, and his mind just stopped working. It was the picture he had taken of the canopy that morning, right before Marcus had run into the tree line. David had taken it to document the weird, unbroken blue sky. But looking at the developed photo, the truth finally collapsed on them. It wasn't the sky. The blue was too flat, too matte, too perfect. And running straight through the upper third of the frame, partially obscured by the mahogany branches, was a perfectly straight geometric seam. They hadn't been looking at the atmosphere, they had been looking at the underside of something massive. Something metallic, painted a perfect camouflage blue, hovering completely silently, maybe 200 feet above the canopy. And in the bottom right corner of the frame, blurred by violent upward motion, was a shape. A human shape suspended 50 feet in the air, being pulled straight up into the blue mass. Which brings us to the realization. The suffocating heat, the dead silence, the melted electronics that left the leaves completely unburned. It wasn't a storm rolling in, it was exhaust. A localized, highly focused thermal displacement from whatever propulsion system was keeping that massive structure quietly suspended above their camp. Hector hadn't been running away. He had been dragged upward, his boots only touching the mud every 12 feet as he fought against the gravity pulling him into the sky. The aftermath of something like this is never cinematic. It's just sad, and it leaves a permanent stain on your life. The U.S. Embassy got involved. There were closed-door meetings, non-disclosure agreements shoved in their faces by men in very cheap suits, and then they were quietly put on a red-eye flight back to Miami. Eric moved back to a cookie-cutter suburb outside of Dallas. He rarely goes outside now. He keeps his house at a freezing 65 degrees, and he keeps a box fan running on high in every single room, 24/7, because he is absolutely terrified of silence. He needs the white noise to prove to himself that the air is moving. And David tried to move on. He tried to rationalize it as a military drone test, some classified black site project. But last October, the lingering trauma finally caught up to him. He was cleaning out his garage in Ohio, sorting through old plastic bins. And at the bottom of one of the bins, under a pile of mildewed canvas tents, he found his old Garmin GPS. The one that had completely died in the jungle. It was turned on. The screen was glowing faintly in the dim garage. The battery icon was completely full, and honestly, that should be impossible after 3 years sitting in a box. But it gets worse. David picked it up, his hands trembling, and looked at the display. It wasn't showing a map of his neighborhood, it was showing a single active waypoint, a proximity alert. The coordinates were identical to his exact location, right there in his garage. But the altitude reading wasn't ground level. The altitude reading was 500 feet. And as David stared at the little pixelated numbers, the reading dropped 400 feet. 300 feet. 200 feet. David slowly walked out onto his concrete driveway, stood in the middle of his quiet suburban cul-de-sac, and looked up at the perfectly blue, totally silent sky. The red cart, a gruesome discovery at Target. Picture a Target parking lot, the giant glowing red bullseye, endless black asphalt shimmering in the summer heat, families loading paper towels and iced coffees into minivans. It feels safe, predictable, almost boring. But on a blistering Tuesday afternoon in late August, that illusion shattered completely. Because in the farthest corner of the lot, where the security cameras dissolve into grainy static, a teenage cart attendant found something so horrifying that seasoned homicide detectives later admitted they could barely sleep after seeing it. Let's rewind. August 14th. The temperature hovered around 96 degrees, with suffocating Midwest humidity pressing down like a wet blanket. We're in an upper-middle-class suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. Josh, 17 years old, was halfway through a miserable summer shift collecting shopping carts. Sweat soaked through his red polo shirt. One earbud played a podcast while he shoved long rows of wobbling carts across melting asphalt. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just waiting for 4 p.m. so he could go home, sit under blasting air conditioning, and forget about the tar sticking to his sneakers. Target parking lots are enormous. Most customers fight for spots close to the automatic doors, leaving the outer sections nearly abandoned. So when Josh pushed a line of carts toward the last cart corral, he noticed a silver 2008 Nissan Altima parked alone in Section F near the tree line bordering the interstate. The windows were deeply tinted. A reflective sunshade covered the windshield. At first, it seemed normal enough. Maybe an employee car, maybe someone sleeping during a lunch break. But as Josh moved closer, the heat rising from the pavement carried something else, a smell. If you've ever passed roadkill baking on the side of a highway, you know the odor is bad. This was worse. Thick, sweet, metallic. The kind of smell that instantly triggers panic somewhere deep in your nervous system. Josh gagged immediately. He dropped the cart strap and pulled his shirt collar over his nose as he stepped closer. That's when he noticed the flies. Hundreds of them swarming frantically around the seams of the trunk. Then he looked down. A dark, viscous liquid was slowly pooling beneath the rear bumper, spreading across the hot pavement. Josh didn't touch the car. He didn't knock on the window. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the curb, and called his shift manager. Dave had worked retail for 15 years. He'd dealt with shoplifters, parking lot fights, and Black Friday stampedes. But the second he walked into Section F and caught the smell drifting through the heat, his expression changed instantly. He didn't say a word. He grabbed his radio, told customer service to block off the rear half of the parking lot, and dialed 911. Within minutes, the normal suburban atmosphere collapsed into chaos. Police cruisers rolled into the lot, their silent flashing lights reflecting off the giant red Target sign. At that point, the responding officers were desperately hoping for what they called a freezer meat scenario. As bizarre as it sounds, it happens surprisingly often in rural areas. Hunters transport deer or bulk meat in car trunks. Vehicles get abandoned. The meat rots in summer heat until fluids leak everywhere. Officer Reynolds, a 10-year veteran, tried reassuring his rookie partner. "Probably just a dumped deer," he muttered while wiping sweat from his forehead. And honestly, at that moment, it made sense. Your brain wants a logical explanation when you're staring at biological fluid leaking from a trunk in broad daylight. You need it to be an animal. Then, dispatch ran the VIN number through the windshield. The plates had already been removed. That was the first major red flag. A minute later, the radio crackled back. The Nissan Altima had been reported stolen from Cleveland 3 weeks earlier. Everything changed instantly. Now, it was a crime scene. Reynolds retrieved a pry bar from the cruiser while the rookie officer secured the area with yellow tape. The metallic crack of the trunk latch echoed sharply across the parking lot, and then the pressure released. Superheated gas exploded outward, carrying a smell so overwhelming that the rookie officer immediately turned away and vomited onto the gravel. Decomposition inside sealed summer heat doesn't just smell bad, it invades you, it coats your throat, your lungs, your clothes. Inside the trunk sat a massive shape wrapped tightly in translucent plastic sheeting and layers of silver duct tape. Reynolds pulled on nitrile gloves and crouched closer. He still hoped it was an animal. He cut a slow 6-inch slit through the plastic with his pocket knife, then peeled it back. The dead deer theory vanished instantly, because underneath the plastic was a human arm, pale, rigid, but something about it made no sense. The arm looked clean, almost surgically cleaned, which completely contradicted the state of decomposition leaking from the vehicle. Then, Reynolds noticed something tucked carefully beneath the duct tape around the wrist. A pristine white envelope, perfectly dry, untouched by the decay surrounding it. Written across the front in elegant cursive was a single word, Charlie. Think about how surreal that is. 100 yards away, shoppers were buying diapers, iced coffees, and school supplies, while automatic doors chimed cheerfully open and shut. And here, near the tree line, a nightmare was being unwrapped. At this point, protocol slowed everything down. Reynolds used sterile tweezers to lift the envelope. Inside was a glossy Polaroid photograph and a small cardstock tag. The cardstock came first. It was a hospital bassinet card, the kind attached to newborn cribs in maternity wards, pink and blue border, black handwritten ink. Name, Charlie. Date, 2 days earlier. Weight, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. The entire atmosphere around the car changed instantly. Reynolds carefully peeled more duct tape away from the victim's wrist. There it was, a hospital identification bracelet still fastened around the arm. The killer hadn't cleaned the body to destroy evidence. He cleaned the wrist so he could place the bracelet back on. Then came the photograph. Reynolds stared at it silently for several seconds before walking away from the trunk and bracing himself against the gravel shoulder, trying not to collapse. The victim was identified as 6-year-old Sarah Jenkins, owner of the Nissan Altima, reported missing from Cleveland 3 weeks earlier, 8.5 months pregnant. But the body inside the trunk wasn't pregnant anymore. The killer had abducted Sarah, held her somewhere for weeks, waited until she gave birth, then murdered her afterward, and finally drove her body to a suburban Target parking lot filled with families and young mothers, just to leave behind a twisted birth announcement. By late afternoon, the parking lot looked unreal. Crime scene tape stretched across rows of asphalt while red and blue lights flashed against the cheerful Target logo. Shoppers continued pushing carts nearby, completely unaware of the horror sitting yards away. The rookie officer had to be sent home after suffering a panic attack. He had a 6-month-old daughter himself and couldn't stop shaking. Even veteran investigators struggled with the emotional weight of the scene. Every ordinary object inside the car felt cruelly personal. Fast food wrappers, a stale coffee cup, receipts from grocery stores, fragments of a life interrupted. But the final detail is the one Detective Reynolds later admitted still haunted him years afterward. Investigators reviewed Target security footage, expecting to identify when the vehicle had been abandoned. They rewound the footage, then rewound further. The Altima hadn't arrived that day. It had been sitting in that exact parking space for over 2 weeks. People parked beside it, children walked past it, shopping carts bumped into it. So how did the perfectly clean envelope appear on the body only hours before discovery? They fast-forwarded the footage to that same morning, 10:14 a.m. A man in a gray hoodie walked casually across the parking lot carrying a baby carrier covered by a light blanket. He approached the Altima using a key, opened the trunk. Even through the security footage, heat distortion rippled visibly from inside. The man leaned into the trunk for several minutes. Investigators later determined he had cleaned the victim's wrist and placed the envelope there himself. Then, before closing the trunk, he stepped backward, holding the baby carrier carefully against his chest. For 5 long seconds, he tilted the carrier toward the open trunk, like he was showing the baby its mother one final time. Then, he shut the trunk, turned, and disappeared into the endless suburban sprawl, carrying baby Charlie with him. Neither of them has ever been found. Top 5 Bingeable Scary Stories, Killer Next Door Edition. Narrator. Think about the wall next to your bed. If you live in an apartment, a townhouse, or a suburban duplex, there is exactly 6 inches of drywall, wood studs, and fiberglass insulation separating your sleeping head from whoever lives next door. 6 inches. That is the length of a dollar bill. That is the only thing standing between your safe haven and a complete stranger. Welcome to the Top 5 Bingeable Scary Stories, Killer Next Door Edition. Because sometimes the monster isn't hiding in the deep woods. Sometimes they're borrowing your weed whacker. Narrator. Let's start with story number 1. We'll call it The Shared Wall. It was October 2018. The kind of crisp, upstate New York autumn where the air always smells a little bit like wood smoke and wet leaves. Sarah, a 8-year-old pediatric nurse, had just closed on her first house in a quiet subdivision about 10 miles outside of Syracuse. It was a modest 2-story duplex. Nothing fancy, but it had a little fenced backyard, a newly paved driveway, and most importantly, it was hers. Sarah worked grueling 1-2 hour night shifts. Her entire world revolved around sleeping during the day, drinking stale diner coffee by the gallon, and trying to maintain some semblance of a normal functioning life. Her neighbor in the adjoining unit was a guy named Greg. Greg was unremarkable. Mid-40s, receding hairline, always wore beige fleece vests. He worked from home doing data entry or something equally mind-numbing. He was the kind of guy who brought his trash bins in exactly at 7 a.m. on garbage day and kept his lawn mowed to exactly 2 inches. And honestly, as a single woman living alone for the first time, a boring, predictable neighbor is exactly what you want. He'd wave from his porch, she'd wave back from her car. They never spoke for more than 30 seconds. It was the perfect, invisible American suburban arrangement until the second week of November. Narrator. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah was lying in bed, trying to catch up on sleep before a 7 p.m. shift. The house was dead quiet. And then she heard it. It was muffled, vibrating through the shared wall right behind her headboard. It sounded heavy, like a 50-pound sack of wet sand being dropped, followed by the metallic drag of something being pulled across the unfinished concrete of the basement floor. Now, at that point, it made sense to just ignore it. People do home renovations. People move heavy furniture. You don't want to be Time's neighbor complaining about a little DIY project. Sarah rolled over, put a pillow over her head, and tried to drown it out. But the sound didn't stop. It went on for 2 hours, exactly the same rhythm, every 15 seconds. And then, right as Sarah was about to get up and bang on the drywall out of sheer exhaustion, she noticed the smell. It was seeping through the baseboards along the shared wall, a heavy, chemical wave of industrial bleach masking something underneath it, something sweet and thick and metallic, like a handful of copper pennies left out in the hot sun. Sarah sat up in bed. The dragging sound in the basement had stopped, but suddenly she heard footsteps coming up the basement stairs next door. Slow, heavy, deliberate steps. They walked across the first floor, walked up the second flight of stairs, and stopped, right on the other side of her bedroom wall. She held her breath, and through 6 inches of drywall, she heard Greg breathing. Heavy, ragged exhales. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, inches away from her face, separated only by a thin layer of plaster, waiting. She lay there for what felt like hours, just staring at the drywall. Eventually, the floorboards creaked, and she heard his footsteps slowly retreat down the hall. Now, if this were a movie, this is the part where Sarah grabs a weapon and goes to investigate. But in the real world, you rationalize. You tell yourself, it's an old townhouse. The walls are paper thin. He was probably just trying to figure out where the noise on my side was coming from. You gaslight yourself into feeling safe, and honestly, what are you supposed to do? Call 911 and tell dispatch your neighbor is breathing too loudly. The next morning, the biting November cold had settled over the neighborhood. Sarah walked out to her car at 6:30 a.m. for her shift. And there was Greg, He was standing by his garden hose in 40-degree weather, scrubbing his hands and forearms with a massive bottle of orange pumice soap, the gritty kind mechanics use to get motor oil out of their pores. He looked haggard. His usual neat beige fleece vest was stained with dark, wet patches. Sarah, running on 2 hours of sleep and desperate to normalize the situation, forced a polite wave. "Hey, Greg. Rough night?" Greg looked up. For a split second, his eyes were dead, totally blank. Then, the polite suburban neighbor mask slid perfectly back into place. "Oh, Sarah, I am so sorry about the racket last night," he said, offering an apologetic, embarrassed chuckle. "My chest freezer in the basement shorted out over the weekend. I had about 100 pounds of venison from my brother's hunting trip in there. It completely thawed and spoiled. Blood everywhere. I had to bag it up, drag it out, and scrub the concrete with industrial bleach. I really hope the smell didn't bother you." And, just like that, the tension evaporated. It made perfect sense. 100 pounds of dead weight being dragged across concrete, thud, scrape, the heavy bleach, the metallic smell of blood. It was gross, sure, but it was a perfectly logical, mundane explanation. Sarah felt a massive wave of relief. She actually felt a little silly for letting her true crime-obsessed brain jump to the worst possible conclusion. She told him not to worry about it, drove to work, and spent the next 3 days completely unbothered. She even bought a couple of Apple Cinnamon Glade plugins to mask the faint chemical smell that was still lingering in her bedroom. But the truth has a funny way of slipping through the cracks. Literally. The following Monday, the property manager, an older woman named Barb, was doing the rounds for the annual smoke detector battery replacements. It's one of those annoying realities of renting. Barb was standing on a step stool in Sarah's kitchen, complaining about the price of 9-volt batteries, when Sarah casually brought up Greg's freezer disaster. "I felt so bad for him," Sarah said, taking a sip of stale coffee. "Losing all that expensive meat." Barb stopped unscrewing the plastic alarm casing. She looked down at Sarah, her eyebrows knitted together in genuine confusion. "Meat?" Barb asked. "What are you talking about?" "The venison," Sarah replied, "in his basement freezer." Barb slowly stepped down from the stool. "Sarah, Greg doesn't hunt, and he certainly doesn't eat venison. He's been a militant vegan for the 5 years he's lived here. He threatened to sue me last spring because the landscapers used a lawn fertilizer that contained bone meal." The apple cinnamon scent in the air suddenly felt sickeningly sweet. Barb wiped her hands on her jeans, looking toward the shared wall. "Plus, these units don't have the electrical capacity for deep freezers in the basements. There are no outlets down there. It's just bare dirt and a concrete slab." Sarah's stomach dropped. The room suddenly felt 10 degrees colder if there was no freezer. And Greg didn't eat meat. Then what exactly was in those heavy bags he was dragging across the concrete? And whose blood was he scrubbing off his hands at 6 in the morning? Sarah didn't say another word to Barb. She just set her coffee mug down on the laminate counter. Her hands were shaking so badly that the ceramic loudly clattered against the surface. She called the police. Not the non-emergency line. 911. When the dispatcher asked for the nature of her emergency, Sarah sounded crazy even to herself. "My neighbor! He told me he was cleaning up spoiled meat, but he's a vegan, and there's no freezer." It took 2 hours for a patrol car to show up. That's the messy reality of suburban policing. 2 officers, one older, looking exhausted, the other holding a clipboard, stood on Sarah's porch. They were polite, but visibly skeptical. Honestly, who wouldn't be? It sounded like a paranoid true crime junkie overreacting to a bad smell and a weird conversation. But Barb, the property manager, was still there. She insisted they do a walkthrough of Greg's unit to check for unauthorized chemical disposal and structural damage. It was a flimsy, bureaucratic excuse, but it gave the officers the probable cause they needed to step through the front door. Greg wasn't home. His apartment was immaculate. Mid-century modern furniture, a stack of junk mail on the dining table, a thriving monstera plant in the corner. It looked completely, terrifyingly normal. Then they opened the basement door. Even with the heavy, lingering scent of industrial bleach, the underlying odor was unmistakable to the older cop. He stopped on the second step and instantly unclipped his radio to call for backup. Down in the basement, there was no freezer, there were no electrical outlets, just a damp dirt floor, and in the far corner, pushed right up against the shared wall of Sarah's bedroom, was a freshly poured slab of concrete, roughly 3 feet wide and 6 feet long. It took a forensics team 3 days to excavate the basement. They didn't find venison. They found a 2-4-year-old nursing student who had vanished from a Target parking lot 2 counties over, nearly 40 miles away. Greg had actually been a person of interest early on in her disappearance. Detectives had matched his silver Honda Civic to blurry security footage, but they never had enough evidence to get a warrant until Sarah made that call. The emotional fallout for Sarah was absolute. She didn't stay another night in that duplex. She packed whatever fit into her car, abandoned her security deposit, and slept on her sister's couch for 2 months. She even threw away her expensive bed frame. She couldn't look at it without remembering how it had vibrated against that shared wall. And honestly, you'd think that catching the guy would bring some kind of closure, a sense of justice, but the trial only made the nightmare worse. During the preliminary hearings, the prosecution laid out the precise timeline of the crime. And that's when the final, crushing reality of that Tuesday morning set in. The medical examiner had determined the victim's time of death. It wasn't Monday night, it was Tuesday morning, right around 6:15 a.m. The heavy, rhythmic Times thud, scrape, thud that Sarah had heard, the noise she rationally explained away as a 100-pound bag of frozen meat being dragged down the wooden stairs. It wasn't a bag, it was the victim. She had managed to get her feet free. She was kicking the shared wall, desperately trying to wake the woman sleeping just 6 inches away on the other side of the drywall. Sarah hadn't been listening to a cleanup. She had been listening to a murder. And she had rolled over, pulled the blankets up, and gone back to sleep. The secret ingredient, the horror at the rusty spoon. Think about the last time you grabbed takeout. You handed over your card, took the heavy paper bag, and trusted that whatever was inside was safe. We all do it. It is an unspoken contract we make every single day. But in the fall of 2019, in a quiet, sprawling suburb just off Interstate 71 Inches, Ohio, that contract wasn't just broken, it was completely shattered. And honestly, it started so quietly that nobody even noticed. Which brings us to Mark. Mark Evans was a 3-4-year-old EMT. He was the kind of guy who practically lived on stale gas station coffee and 1 4-hour shifts. He was tired, he was stressed, and he had a very specific routine. Every Tuesday night, after clocking out at 2 a.m., he would drive exactly 4 miles down a dimly lit county road to a 2 4-hour diner called the Rusty Spoon. It was a local institution, the kind of place with faded vinyl booths, a buzzing neon sign that was always missing, a letter, and the constant smell of fried onions and bleach. It felt safe. It felt like home. Mark would always sit in the same corner booth, order a black coffee, and get the diner's famous slow-cooked meat pie. It was cheap, it was heavy, and it did the job. And on this particular Tuesday, that is exactly what he did. He was sitting there, scrolling through his phone, barely even looking at his plate. The diner was empty, except for a couple of truckers at the counter. The waitress, a sweet, older woman named Brenda, had just refilled his mug. Mark took a large bite of the pie. And that is when it happened. A sharp, jarring crunch echoed in his head. It wasn't the soft crumble of pie crust or the chew of overcooked beef. It was hard, like biting down on a rock. Mark froze. He instinctively spat the bite into a crumpled paper napkin. At first, he just felt annoyed. He assumed it was a piece of gristle or maybe a rogue bone fragment that the kitchen had missed. People make mistakes, right? At that point, it made sense to just brush it off. But as he looked closer under the harsh fluorescent lights of the diner, his annoyance slowly shifted into a deep, sinking confusion. Sitting in the center of the napkin wasn't a pebble. And it wasn't a standard piece of animal bone. It was a small, perfectly curved fragment, about 1.5 inches long. But that wasn't the disturbing part. Embedded directly into the side of this bone fragment was a tiny, unmistakable piece of surgical steel. It looked exactly like a miniature orthopedic pin. Mark stared at it, his medical training kicked in, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. Because he knew, even then, that you do not find surgical pins in a cow. He wrapped the napkin tightly, shoved it into his jacket pocket, and walked out without saying a word. He told himself he was overreacting. But the truth was, the nightmare had already begun. The drive back to Mark's apartment was a blur. He lived in one of those sprawling cookie-cutter complexes just off Interstate 95, the kind where every building looks exactly the same. He sat at his cramped kitchen table, pushed aside a pile of past-due bills and junk mail, and carefully unrolled the napkin. And honestly, looking at it under the cheap yellow overhead light of his apartment, the fragment looked even worse. He grabbed a pair of tweezers from his EMT trauma kit and scraped away the remaining bits of cooked meat. The bone was dense, about 1.5 inches long, and the metal pin was threaded, designed to screw directly into marrow. Mark didn't sleep that night. By 8 a.m., he was exhausted, running on fumes and a pot of stale coffee. He decided to call his buddy Dave, who worked as an inspector for the county health department. Mark explained the situation, expecting Dave to sound horrified. But Dave just sighed. At that point, Dave offered an explanation that actually made perfect sense. He told Mark that Earl, the owner of the Rusty Spoon, was notorious for cutting corners. Beef prices were up, so Earl had started buying cheap, uninspected feral hog meat from local hunters out in the county woods. Dave explained that sometimes hunters used tracking dogs, and those dogs often got injured by the boars. A local vet would pin their broken legs back together. Dave figured a piece of a deceased hunting dog or maybe even a farm pig that had undergone a veterinary procedure accidentally got mixed into the meat grinder. It was a massive health code violation, sure, but it was just a cheap diner being greedy. Mark felt a massive wave of relief wash over him. It was disgusting, absolutely vile, but it was a logical, mundane explanation. He wasn't dealing with a horror movie, he was just dealing with a lazy restaurant owner. Mark agreed to drop the bone fragment off at the health department later that afternoon so Dave could issue a citation. But the truth was about to violently collapse. Before putting the fragment into a plastic evidence bag, Mark took a cotton swab and some rubbing alcohol to clean the grease off the metal pin. As the surgical steel shined under the light, he noticed something he had missed. There was a microscopic engraving near the head of the pin. It was tiny, barely 1/8 of an inch wide. Mark used the macro lens on his smartphone, zooming in as far as the camera would allow. The engraving read, NTO7. Mark sat frozen. He opened his laptop and typed the code into a medical database he used for EMT training. He thought it would pull up a veterinary supply company. It didn't. The search results instantly populated with a catalog from Novatech Orthopedics, a high-end medical manufacturer based in California. The page displayed the exact threaded pin sitting on his kitchen table. It was a phalangeal fixation pin. And right there in bold black letters was the manufacturer's warning for human use only. Designed exclusively for the stabilization of adult finger fractures. The relief Mark felt 10 minutes ago completely vanished, replaced by a suffocating, icy dread. He hadn't eaten a piece of a farm pig. He hadn't eaten a hunting dog. He stared at the empty space on the napkin, his stomach violently turning as the horrific reality set in. Mark barely made it to the bathroom. The realization hit him like a freight train. He collapsed next to the toilet, the cold porcelain pressing against his cheek as his stomach violently emptied itself. He stayed on the bathroom floor for what felt like hours, shivering, his mind racing through the horrific implications. He hadn't just eaten a bad burger. He had consumed human flesh. He didn't call Dave at the health department again. He dialed 911. When the dispatcher asked what his emergency was, Mark honestly didn't know how to say it without sounding insane. I think I just ate someone, he stammered. Within 20 minutes, 2 county sheriff's deputies were standing in his kitchen, looking at the tiny metal pin through the plastic evidence bag. They ran the Novatech serial number through their own forensics database. 10 minutes later, a patrol car was screaming down Route 9 towards the Rusty Spoon. When the police walked into the diner, the lunchtime rush was in full swing. Families were sitting in vinyl booths, eating the exact same chili burgers Mark had ordered. The deputies shut the place down immediately, ordering everyone to drop their forks and step outside. They marched straight into the kitchen. And honestly, you'd expect them to find a dungeon. You'd expect Earl to be some deranged serial killer hiding bodies in the walk-in freezer. But the truth was so much more pathetic, and somehow, so much more disturbing. When the deputies cornered Earl in his cramped, cigarette-stained back office, he didn't even try to run. He just looked exhausted. And that is when they noticed a teenager, maybe 19 years old, sitting on a milk crate by the dish pit. His name was Toby. He was a local kid Earl paid under the table to clean the kitchen. Toby was cradling his right hand, which was wrapped in a filthy, blood-soaked towel. 3 days prior, Toby had been cleaning the industrial meat grinder while it was still plugged in. His hand slipped. The auger caught his heavy rubber glove and pulled him in. He lost his index and middle fingers right there on the stainless steel prep table. But Earl didn't call an ambulance. His workers' comp insurance had lapsed months ago, and he knew a hospital visit would bring OSHA crashing down on his restaurant, likely shutting him down for good. So Earl wrapped the kid's hand in gauze, handed him $200 in cash, and told him to keep quiet and go home. But what about the meat? There was 40 pounds of premium ground chuck sitting in the hopper when Toby's hand went through the blades. To Earl, throwing away 40 pounds of beef meant losing about $150. And Earl was notoriously obsessively cheap. He couldn't stomach the financial loss. So he just mixed the contaminated meat into the rest of the batch, added extra chili powder to mask any metallic taste of blood, and served it as the weekend special. Mark spent the next 6 months living in an absolute nightmare. He had to undergo a grueling battery of blood tests at the local clinic, checking for hepatitis, HIV, and every blood-borne pathogen you can imagine. The physical tests came back clean, but the psychological damage was permanent. He lost 15 pounds. Every time he drove past a fast food sign, he felt a wave of nausea. He couldn't even look at a barbecue grill without his mind flashing back to that tiny surgical steel pin covered in grease. The rusty spoon was boarded up for good. Earl was sentenced to 4 years in a state penitentiary for reckless endangerment and tampering with evidence. The community tried to move on. But there is one detail from the police report that still haunts Mark to this day. You see, Toby had been in a bad dirt bike accident a few years back. The doctors had reconstructed his hand using surgical pins. According to his medical records, there were a total of 4 phalangeal fixation pins in his severed fingers. When the police seized the remaining meat from Earl's freezer, they sifted through every single patty. They didn't find any more pins. Mark only found one. Which means somewhere out there in that quiet suburban town, 3 other people finished their meals. 3 other people wiped their mouths, paid their tabs, and went home, completely unaware of what they had just swallowed. The Utah anomaly. The skinwalker reality. So, if you want to find out what actually happens when you throw millions of dollars, military-grade sensors, and a team of PhDs at a paranormal hotspot, you look at the Uintah Basin in Utah. Specifically, a 480-acre patch of dirt known as Skinwalker Ranch. But before the scientists showed up, before the Department of Defense got involved, there was just a family trying to live a quiet life. And honestly, that's where the real horror is. Let's go back to the fall of 1994. Meet Terry and Gwen Sherman. Now, Terry is the furthest thing from a paranormal enthusiast. He's a pragmatic, rugged guy. He fixes tractors. He reads cattle prices, not sci-fi. He and his wife bought this sprawling property because it was a dream investment. They wanted to raise their kids, run their cattle, and just be left alone in the vast, cold, dry air of Utah. The first few days on the ranch were totally mundane. They spent their time carrying heavy cardboard boxes, sorting through forwarded junk mail, and drinking stale coffee from a thermos at 5 a.m. But as they were unpacking, they started noticing little things. Just off things. For instance, the locks. Every single door in the house, both inside and out, was rigged with heavy industrial-grade deadbolts. Even the closets had deadbolts on the times inside. Now, at this point, Terry just figured the previous owners were intensely paranoid elderly folks. They lived way out in the country, after all. It made sense. So, they laughed it off. They downplayed it, like any normal person would. which actually mattered later because that rationalization is the first thing your brain does to protect you from the terrifying reality of a situation. But the real disturbance, the thing that forced them to realize that something was fundamentally broken on this property, happened on a gray, overcast afternoon shortly after they moved in. The family was out by the cattle pens. Terry was leaning against the wooden fence, probably smelling the diesel from his truck and the damp earth, when he saw an animal approaching from the tree line. At first glance, it looked like a wolf. But the scale of it was completely wrong. It was massive, nearly 3 times the size of a normal timber wolf. It had pale blue eyes, and its coat was perfectly groomed. It didn't act aggressively. In fact, it slowly trotted right up to the family. It was so calm that Terry, despite his better judgment, actually let his kids pet it. It smelled like wet dog and ozone. It seemed entirely tame. At least, not yet a threat. And then, without any warning, the wolf lunged. But it didn't go for Terry or the kids. It snapped its jaws entirely over the snout of a nearby calf, trying to drag it through the fence bars. The calf started screaming that horrible, high-pitched bleating sound. Terry reacted purely on rancher instinct. He grabbed his .357 Magnum from the truck, ran up to the wolf, and fired a heavy-grain hollow point directly into its ribs from point-blank range. A .357 Magnum at that distance should drop almost any animal on Earth. But the wolf didn't even flinch. It didn't drop the calf. It didn't bleed. It just stood there. Terry, his ears ringing from the gunshot, completely bewildered, shot it again. This time, the wolf slowly released the calf. It turned its head, looked Terry dead in the eyes with an almost bored expression, and then calmly trotted away into the muddy pasture. Terry was shaking. He grabbed a high-powered hunting rifle from his cab, chased after it, and shot it a third time from a distance. He actually saw a chunk of flesh fly off the animal. But the wolf didn't break its stride. It just kept jogging toward the woods. Terry tracked the animal for about a mile. The paw prints in the mud were gigantic, deeply pressed into the soft earth. He followed them across the field, his heart pounding, his mind desperately trying to rationalize what he had just experienced. And then the tracks just stopped. They didn't fade out. They didn't lead into the brush. In the middle of an open, muddy field, the giant paw prints simply vanished. As if this massive, impossible creature had just lifted off the ground and dissolved into the cold Utah sky. Terry stood there in the absolute silence of the basin, the wind biting at his jacket, looking at the empty mud. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He just experienced that sickening, quiet realization that everything he knew about the world was suddenly violently incorrect. Now, at this point, if you or I track a giant bulletproof wolf into a muddy field and watch its footprints simply cease to exist, we are packing our bags, we're loading up the truck, and we are gone. But you have to remember who Terry Sherman is. He's a rugged, pragmatic rancher. He has his entire life savings, his family's future, sunk into this land. He can't just leave. So he does what humans do when confronted with the impossible. He rationalizes it. Terry walked back to his truck, his boots heavy with wet clay, his mind scrambling for a logical foothold. Maybe the bullets were defective. Maybe the mud was firmer where the tracks stopped. He drove back to the house, the heater blasting, but he couldn't shake the chill in his bones. That night, over a quiet dinner, Terry and Gwen downplayed the whole thing. They told themselves it was just a strange hybrid, maybe a feral dog crossed with a wolf, and it had somehow slipped into the brush when Terry blinked. They desperately needed the world to make sense. But over the next few months, the world flatly refused to make sense. It started with mundane things. Small, procedural messiness that you'd normally brush off. Terry would be fixing a fence line, set down a pair of heavy wire cutters, turn around to grab a staple, and the cutters would be gone. At first, he second-guessed himself. He figured he was just getting tired, losing his memory from the physical toll of running the ranch. But then, it escalated. One afternoon, Terry was digging fence posts. He left a heavy iron post-hole digger, a tool that weighs a good 70 pounds, leaning against a wooden rail. He walked maybe 50 feet to his truck to get a drink of water from his thermos. He heard no sound, no vehicle, no footsteps. When he walked back 30 seconds later, the 70-pound tool was completely gone. The wind doesn't blow away an iron tool. An animal doesn't drag it off without making a sound. And honestly, this is where the quiet, creeping fear really started to set in. Because things were moving inside the house too. Gwen would put the groceries away, and the next morning, the canned goods would be arranged in a perfect, geometric circle on the kitchen floor. Towels would be inexplicably moved. Doors they knew they had locked would be found standing wide open. So they sat down at the kitchen table one night, drinking stale coffee, listening to the absolute, suffocating silence of the basin outside. They came up with a theory, the false explanation that kept them sane. It was teenagers. Local kids from the nearby town, or maybe rival ranchers, playing elaborate pranks to scare the new family off the property. It was a logical theory. It felt grounded. It gave them a human enemy they could fight. Terry drove into town and bought heavy-duty padlocks. He installed thick deadbolts on every single door and window of the house, which actually mattered a lot later. But for now, it gave them an illusion of control. Terry started doing night patrols. He would park his truck near the tree line, leave the engine idling to keep the heater going against the bitter Utah frost, and just sit there. He'd grip his hunting rifle, his eyes watering as he scanned the dark, waiting for these imaginary teenagers to slip up. Then came the night the illusion completely collapsed. It was mid-November. The air was so cold it burned your lungs. Terry was out on his patrol, checking on a pregnant prized heifer. He saw her grazing near a patch of scrub oak. She was completely fine, healthy. He drove the truck about half a mile down the ridge to check a broken fence wire, struggling with his frozen hands for maybe 15 minutes, and then drove slowly back. As his headlights swept over the scrub oak, he saw the heifer. She was lying on her side in the frost. Terry grabbed his rifle, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs, and approached slowly. He expected a predator, attack coyotes, maybe a cougar, but as he got closer, there was no blood. The scene was completely pristine. He clicked on his heavy flashlight, and what he saw shattered the prankster theory forever. The cow was dead, but it hadn't been attacked. It had been dismantled. A massive, perfectly circular hole had been cored out of its left eye. Its left ear was cleanly sliced off, and its reproductive organs had been removed with a surgical precision that would require an operating room. There were no jagged edges, no teeth marks, and again, not a single drop of blood on the snow. But what really made Terry's blood run cold was the smell. It wasn't the smell of death. It was a foul, aggressive chemical odor, like industrial bleach mixed with copper and ozone. He spun around, shining his light into the empty, pitch-black field. He checked the ground around the carcass. The frost was entirely undisturbed. There were no tire tracks from pranksters. No paw prints from a predator. Not even a single human footprint leading up to the cow. Whoever or whatever had done this had done it in absolute silence, in the dark, in a 15-minute window without ever touching the ground. Terry stood there in the freezing night, the chemical smell burning his nose, and realized he wasn't hunting kids. He was being watched by something he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Terry didn't run back to his truck. He just stood there in the freezing snow, staring at the perfectly cored eye of his prized heifer, breathing in that aggressive, metallic, chemical smell. And honestly, it was in that exact moment that the reality of the situation actually settled into his bones. It wasn't kids. It wasn't a cult. It was something entirely outside the bounds of normal human logic. The drive back to the farmhouse was agonizingly slow. Terry kept the truck's heater blasting on high, but he couldn't stop shivering. When he finally walked through the back door, the house smelled like stale coffee and wet wool. Gwen was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a mug. She took one look at his pale, drawn face and didn't even ask what he found. Terry locked the heavy deadbolt behind him, listening to the heavy brass times-click times slide into the frame. Now, at this point, you have to remember, those deadbolts, Terry had installed them on every single entry point. Heavy, industrial-grade locks. For months, those locks were their only psychological lifeline. The nightly routine became a grim, silent ritual. Check the windows, lock the doors, load the shotguns, and sit in the living room until the sun came up. They were sleep-deprived, constantly on edge, jumping at the sound of the wind rattling the siding. The mundane reality of their lives had become a state of continuous, exhausted terror. But the false sense of security those deadbolts provided was about to be completely shattered. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Broad daylight. You usually expect the terrifying stuff to happen at 3 a.m. in the pitch dark, but real horror doesn't care about cinematic timing. It was just a boring, overcast afternoon. Gwen was standing at the kitchen island, idly sorting through a stack of junk mail. Terry was sitting at the table, rubbing his eyes, trying to force down a cold sandwich. The house was locked up tight, as always. Suddenly, from the back hallway, there was a massive, concussive times thud. It wasn't a creak. It was the heavy, unmistakable sound of dead weight hitting the hardwood floor. Terry dropped his sandwich. He grabbed the loaded rifle, leaning against the fridge, motioning for Gwen to stay behind him. He crept down the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs, the barrel of the gun shaking ever so slightly. The house was dead silent. Dust motes drifted lazily in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the hallway window. He reached the bathroom, nudged the door open with his boot, and just stared. Sitting perfectly upright in the middle of the bathroom rug was his 7 0-pound iron post-hole digger. Terry slowly lowered the rifle. He felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He had used that exact tool 3 days ago. He remembered exactly where he left it, leaning against a fence post over 2 miles away on the far edge of the property. He backed out of the bathroom and methodically checked the house. Every window was shut and locked from the inside. Every deadbolt was still securely thrown. There were no muddy footprints, no signs of forced entry. Nothing. And that was the twist that finally broke them. The darkest truth of the ranch wasn't that there were monsters in the dark. It was the realization that whatever this intelligence was, it could bypass physical reality entirely. It had effortlessly bypassed space, time, and solid wood just to drop a heavy tool in their house. The deadbolts weren't locking the danger out. They were just locking the family inside a cage. The phenomenon wasn't just existing around them, it was actively playing with them, mocking them. The emotional aftermath of that day was devastating. You can't fight something that ignores the laws of physics. Gwen's hair began falling out in clumps from the sheer stress. Terry lost 20 pounds. They stopped patrolling. They just huddled in the center of the house, waiting for the nightmare to end. Eventually, they broke. They put the ranch up for sale, desperate to just survive. And this is where the story shifts, because their desperate sale caught the attention of Robert Bigelow, a billionaire aerospace contractor who funded a group called the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS. Suddenly, the isolated, terrified family was replaced by a team of PhDs, astrophysicists, and biologists. They rolled onto the property with Pelican cases full of million-dollar equipment. This wasn't a family with a rifle anymore. This was institutional, scientific scrutiny. The scientists wanted to measure it. They wanted to prove it. So they set up heavy-duty, tamper-proof cameras on tall telephone poles, hardwired with thick, shielded cables, all feeding back to a secure command center. They had cameras pointing at the fields, and more importantly, they had cameras pointing times at the other cameras' times to ensure nobody could tamper with them. But the ranch didn't care about PhDs. On the very first week of monitoring, the scientists were sitting in the command center when the feed from one of the primary cameras suddenly flared into heavy static and then went completely black. They rushed out to the pole, expecting a power failure or maybe a bird strike. When they got there, they found the heavy PVC casing completely shattered. The thick, shielded wires hadn't been ripped or chewed by an animal. They had been cleanly, surgically snipped. Baffled, the scientists went back to the command center to review the footage from the Time's secondary Times camera, the one specifically positioned to watch the first camera. If someone or something had climbed that pole, it would be on tape. They rewound the VHS tape and hit play. They watched the footage of the pole. The camera was fine, and then, precisely 3 seconds before the wire was snipped, the tape on the secondary camera just blanked. It didn't lose power. It wasn't destroyed. The electromagnetic data on the tape had simply been erased, exactly for the duration of the attack, before seamlessly kicking back on to show the destroyed equipment. That was the final, sickening aftershock for the NIDS team. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The entity didn't just break a camera. It knew exactly what a camera was. It understood how human observation worked, how closed-circuit television operated, and how magnetic tape recorded data. It temporarily blinded the secondary camera just long enough to destroy the first one, purely to leave a message. They weren't scientists observing a paranormal phenomenon in a laboratory. The ranch itself was the laboratory. And the humans, with their million-dollar cameras, they were just the new lab rats. The $10,000 ghost. If you ask an attorney about the weirdest thing a client has ever handed them, you'll usually hear stories about strange family heirlooms, or maybe a messy confession scrawled on a bar napkin. But for Marcus Reed, a painfully ordinary estate lawyer working out of a faded brick office park in Dayton, Ohio, the answer is always the same. It was a Tuesday afternoon. October 14th. The air conditioning in Marcus's office had been rattling all morning, and he was halfway through a stale cup of break-room coffee, absent-mindedly sorting through the daily stack of junk mail. That's when the courier arrived. He dropped a heavy manila envelope on Marcus's desk. Inside was a cashier's check for exactly $10,000 and a smaller sealed black envelope. Clipped to the front was a handwritten post-it note. It read, "Marcus, do not open the black envelope until you see my name in the obituaries. When that happens, use this money to find out who killed me." The note was signed by Elias Thorne. And honestly, the most disturbing part of this entire situation wasn't just the message itself. It was the fact that Elias Thorne had been sitting in Marcus's office just 3 days prior, perfectly healthy, making awkward small talk about the weather while signing some routine living trust documents. Music. To understand how we get to that sealed black envelope, we have to go back about 6 months. Back to a very quiet, very normal suburban street. Elias Thorne was 58 years old, and by all accounts, he was a ghost of a man. I don't mean that in a spooky way. I just mean he was completely invisible to the world. He was a senior auditor for a regional logistics firm. He drove a beige 2014 Honda Accord. He lived alone in a modest, single-story ranch house at the end of a cul-de-sac, having amicably divorced over a decade ago. His life was governed by a strict, almost suffocating routine. Thursdays at 6 p.m., he bought groceries. Saturdays at 8 a.m., he washed the Accord. He wasn't involved in organized crime. He didn't have hidden gambling debts. He was just a quiet man who liked to read historical biographies on his back patio while listening to the distant, rhythmic ticking of his neighbor's sprinkler system. Which is why, when Elias first started feeling like something was wrong, he didn't tell anyone. At least, not yet. Now, at this point, if you or I thought someone was watching us, we might call the police, or at least mention it to a friend. But Elias was an auditor. He dealt in probabilities and cold, hard facts. And the probability of someone targeting a painfully average 5-8-year-old man was statistically 0. So he rationalized it. The first disturbance happened in early May. Elias woke up on a Tuesday morning, went into his master bathroom, and froze. His bottle of daily allergy medication, which he rigidly kept on the far left side of the medicine cabinet, label facing perfectly forward, was sitting on the right side of the bottom shelf. Lying on its side. And honestly, most people wouldn't even register that. A misplaced bottle. Big deal. But Elias did. He stood there in the dead quiet of his bathroom, the hum of the fluorescent vanity light buzzing above him, and he just stared at it. He tried to mentally retrace his steps. Had he been tired the night before? Had he bumped it while reaching for the toothpaste? He stood there for a long time, feeling the cold tile under his bare feet, trying to force a logical explanation into his brain. Eventually, he sighed, picked up the bottle, and put it back in its proper place. He told himself he was just getting older. His memory was slipping. Which, if we're being fair, is exactly what any rational person would think. It happens to everyone. But then, 2 weeks later, it was the porch light. Elias came home from a late shift at work around 9:30 p.m. It was raining one of those miserable, slow, freezing drizzles. He pulled into his driveway and noticed the front porch was pitch black. He assumed the bulb had finally burned out. But when he unlocked the front door, set his damp briefcase down, and reached up into the fixture to change it, the bulb wasn't dead. It had been unscrewed. Just half a turn. Just enough to break the electrical connection. Elias stood on his porch in the freezing rain, his fingers gripping the damp glass of the light bulb. He looked out into the darkness of his front yard, listening to the rain hissing against the pavement. He didn't see anyone out there. He didn't hear any footsteps. But in that moment, a deep, primal knot of dread settled into his stomach. Someone had been on his porch. Someone had purposely plunged his entryway into darkness. At the time, this didn't seem like the start of a sophisticated murder plot. It felt like a cruel prank. Maybe bored teenagers from the neighborhood casing houses? That's what he told his coworker the next day in the break room while pouring a cup of coffee. He laughed it off. He downplayed it. Because that's what we do. We try to convince ourselves we aren't in danger. But by August, the quiet, mundane disturbances had escalated into something impossible to ignore. And Elias Thorne, the man who lived his entire life by the numbers, realized the odds were finally catching up to him. He was absolutely convinced someone was going to murder him. He just needed to figure out how to prove it after he was gone. By mid-August, these subtle, deniable things gave way to aggressive, undeniable intrusions. It wasn't just unscrewed light bulbs anymore. Elias started coming home to an empty house that didn't feel empty. On Tuesday, August 14th, he walked into his living room and found the air conditioning cranked down to 60 degrees. Elias was a man who hated the cold. He always kept the thermostat strictly at 72. 2 days later, he found a faint, muddy footprint on the linoleum near the back door. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than, now. At this point, you might be screaming at your screen, asking why he didn't just call the police. Well, he did. But real life isn't an action movie. When the patrol officers showed up, they stood in his kitchen, smelling of stale coffee and damp uniforms, and looked at the smudged dirt on the floor. They pointed out that Elias lived alone, he had a habit of leaving his gardening shoes by the door, and there was absolutely zero sign of forced entry. They took a report, but Elias could see the look they exchanged. That polite, weary look cops give when they think they're dealing with a lonely guy losing his grip on reality is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. And honestly, that was the most terrifying part for Elias. No one believed him. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. So, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, Elias walked into the law office of Arthur Vance, a local estate attorney he had known for a decade. The office was quiet, the only sound, the steady ticking of a wall clock, and the hum of traffic outside. Elias looked exhausted. His clothes were rumpled, and he hadn't shaved. Without a word, he reached into his briefcase and placed a manila envelope on the polished mahogany desk, right next to Arthur's half-eaten turkey sandwich. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. Inside was a cashier's check for $10,000. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. Keep this in escrow, Elias told him, his voice trembling but deadly serious. When they find me dead, I don't want you to trust the police. I want you to use this money to hire a private investigator. You find out who did it. A is less than BR is greater than is less than. BR is greater than Arthur just stared at him. He tried to reason with Elias. He asked him if he was sleeping, if he had seen a doctor recently. Because, from the outside, the explanation for all of this seemed tragically simple. The false explanation that everyone from the police to his neighbors to his own lawyer silently agreed upon. Elias Thorne, a 4-year-old divorced man living alone, was suffering from a severe, early-onset paranoid breakdown. His family had a history of dementia. The misplaced mouthwash, the thermostat, the paranoia, it all fit the clinical profile of a mind turning against itself. Arthur took the check, but purely to humor him, hoping it would give Elias some peace of mind. At least, not yet knowing how wrong he was, is less than BR, is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. Arthur assumed the crisis had passed. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. Then came September 9th. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. It was an unusually hot Monday. Elias's next-door neighbor noticed that Elias's mail had been spilling out of the roadside mailbox since Thursday. His car was still in the driveway. The neighbor walked over, knocked on the door, and noticed a strange metallic smell lingering near the garage. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. The police arrived at 2:15 p.m. They found Elias Thorne dead in the front seat of his sedan, parked inside his closed garage. The keys were in the ignition. The gas tank was empty. The initial ruling was exactly what everyone expected: suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. A tragic, logical end to a man's rapid mental decline. It was a neat, tidy explanation that closed the case before it even opened. Is less than BR, is greater than is less than BR, is greater than. The truth had seemingly collapsed into a sad, mundane statistic. Is less than BR, is greater than BR. Is less than BR, is greater than BR. Arthur felt a terrible wave of guilt. He sat in his office, looking at the check still sitting in his safe, wondering if he could have done more to get Elias psychiatric help. He prepared to transfer the funds back to Elias's modest estate. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. But 3 days later, the mail arrived. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. Arthur's secretary dropped a small, padded yellow envelope on his desk. It was postmarked Wednesday, September 4th, the day before Elias supposedly drove his car into a closed garage and took his own life. Arthur opened it with a silver letter opener. Inside was a single cheap plastic flash drive and a handwritten note on a torn piece of legal paper. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. The note said, Arthur, I don't know how to drive a manual transmission. Check the car. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. Arthur froze. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He immediately picked up the phone and called the detective who had signed off on the scene. He asked one question. What kind of car was Elias found in? Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The detective shuffled through his notes. A 2008 Honda Civic, the detective replied. 5-speed stick shift, is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. In an instant, the tidy explanation of a tragic suicide shattered. The walls of Arthur's quiet office suddenly felt like they were closing in. Elias Thorne hadn't killed himself. He had been murdered, staged to look like a suicide, by someone who made one tiny, critical mistake. They used Elias's project car, a car he had bought to restore but physically didn't know how to drive. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than, and now Arthur had $10,000 to hunt a ghost. Now at this point, Arthur didn't call the police back right away. And honestly, I don't blame him. He just hung up the phone, locked his office door, and stared at that cheap plastic flash drive sitting on his desk. The hum of the building's air conditioning suddenly felt incredibly loud. It was 6 p.m. on a Friday. The cleaning staff was vacuuming somewhere down the hall, a completely mundane sound, while Arthur sat alone, realizing he was holding the digital remains of a man who had choreographed his own murder investigation. He poured himself a cup of stale, tepid coffee from the break room, more for the familiar routine of it than anything else, and sat back down. He plugged the drive into his laptop. There was no dramatic encryption. Just a folder containing 2 PDF documents and 1 MP4 video file. Arthur clicked the PDFs first. They were bank statements from Elias's primary savings account. Highlighted in bright digital yellow were dozens of withdrawals over the last 8 months. Small amounts at first, 500 here, 1,000 there, but escalating rapidly. They were checks written to cash. The signatures looked like Elias's, but they were a little too perfect. A total of $142,000 had been quietly siphoned away. Next to the statements was a scanned copy of a municipal property line agreement from 3 years prior. The signature on the agreement was a perfect, identical match to the forged checks. It belonged to Greg Miller, Elias's next-door neighbor. The same concerned neighbor who had found Elias's body and called the police. Arthur's stomach dropped. He clicked on the video file. It was time-stamped Thursday, September 5th at 4:15 p.m., less than 24 hours before Greg supposedly found Elias dead. It was footage from a hidden camera, likely shoved inside a hollowed-out radio or a bookshelf in Elias's kitchen. And you have to understand, watching this footage, it wasn't a movie. There was no tense soundtrack, just the low mechanical drone of Elias's refrigerator and the grainy, washed-out lighting of a late afternoon. Elias was sitting at his kitchen table. He looked exhausted, pale. He was staring at the wall, just waiting. Then there's a knock on the back door. Greg walks in. He's wearing a gray fleece vest and holding a Tupperware container. "Brought you some of that stew, Eli," Greg says. His voice is perfectly friendly. Warm, even. He's the picture of a helpful suburban neighbor checking on the crazy old man next door. They talk for a few minutes about the weather, about the yard. It is sickeningly normal. Then Greg offers to make them both some instant coffee. Elias nods. When Elias turns his head to cough, Greg casually reaches into his fleece vest, pulls out a small prescription bottle, and dumps a heavy dose of crushed powder into Elias's mug. He stirs it with a spoon, taps the spoon on the rim times clink, clink times, and sets it down in front of Elias. Arthur found himself holding his breath, leaning closer to the monitor. Elias looks down at the mug. He sits there, in silence, for a long time. And this is the part that would haunt Arthur for the rest of his life. Because looking at the footage, you can see it in Elias's eyes. He times knows. He knows exactly what is in that cup. He knows Greg has been stealing from him. He knows Greg has been gaslighting him, moving his keys, making him look insane to the rest of the world so no one would believe him when the money went missing. Elias looks up from the mug, and for just a fraction of a second, he makes dead eye contact with the hidden camera lens across the room. Then, he picks up the coffee, and he drinks it. Within 20 minutes, Elias slumps forward onto the table, completely unconscious. The heavy, dead weight of his body makes the wood creak. Greg doesn't panic. He doesn't cackle or act like a mastermind. He just finishes his own coffee, takes his mug to the sink, washes it, dries it with a towel, and puts it in the cabinet. Then he puts on a pair of leather gardening gloves, hooks his arms under Elias's armpits, and drags him out the door toward the garage. His rubber soles squeak slightly on the linoleum. And that was it. The video ended. Arthur sat in the dark. The truth of the reconstruction collapsed over him like a ton of bricks. Greg dragged Elias out to the garage to stage a suicide. He saw the Honda Civic, put Elias in the driver's seat, turned the key, and closed the garage door. Carbon monoxide would take care of the rest. It was a tidy, tragic end that the police bought without a second thought. But Greg made a mistake. He didn't know Elias's left knee had been completely shattered in a workplace accident decades ago. Elias physically could not press a clutch pedal. He hadn't been able to drive a manual transmission in 30 years. Greg just saw a car and used it, unknowingly sealing his own fate with a 2,000-pound mechanical alibi. Arthur called the police. The detective drove over that night to collect the flash drive. The emotional aftermath of the case was remarkably quiet. There was no grand shootout. When the police went to arrest Greg Miller on Saturday morning, he was standing in his driveway in his slippers, taking out the recycling. He looked confused, then resigned. Just a greedy, mundane man who realized he'd been outsmarted by the ghost he had created. For weeks, Arthur felt a profound, lingering sadness. Elias wasn't paranoid. He was a man drowning in plain sight, forced to fund his own post-mortem investigation because the world had already written him off as crazy. But the final aftershock, the detail that kept Arthur awake at night, came 2 months later while he was finalizing the paperwork for Elias's estate. Arthur was looking at the original $10,000 cashier's check Elias had given him. He noted the issue date, August 1st. Just to be thorough, Arthur cross-referenced it with the DMV title records for the 2008 Honda Civic sitting in Elias's garage. Elias had purchased the car on August 2nd for exactly $1,200. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. He sat back in his chair as the true timeline clicked into place. Elias hadn't just bought a project car by accident. He had purposefully bought a manual transmission car a full month in advance. He parked it in his garage and deliberately let the gas tank run near empty so it wouldn't run long enough to destroy the physical evidence inside the cabin. The $10,000 wasn't just to hire Arthur. It was a psychological anchor. Elias knew that if he paid a lawyer $10,000, the lawyer would feel obligated enough to actually look at the case file when he died. Elias Thorne hadn't just predicted his own murder. He had meticulously engineered the crime scene, bought his own coffin, left the keys in the ignition, and sat at his kitchen table, patiently waiting for his neighbor to put him inside.